Stone Mountain in the US state of Georgia. A granite monolith rising 300 meters above the forest canopy, it's a well-known landmark. But in recent years, it has been the subject of controversy. A carving etched into the north face of the rock depicts 3 Confederate leaders of the American Civil War: Jefferson Davis, Stonewall Jackson, and General Robert E. Lee, men whose legacy today is seen by many as having fought to preserve slavery. As such, Stone Mountain has seen violence. Civil rights protesters demanding its removal as a racist monument have clashed with conservative organisations who defend it. In the deep south of the United States, it's a topic everyone has an opinion on.
I think it's ridiculous. I think we're here to learn from our past, what has happened, what can we do better, and taking down the statue doesn't erase what's happened in the past, So I think we should learn versus hide our feelings from what should really be.
Outside of what the subject is, this is a beautiful area, and it's a beautiful monument. And we were even discussing, what did it take to make it? How many labor hours and how many blood and sweat and tears did it take from the sculpture to be able to do that? It's a feat among itself.
I mean, I see this as being racist. It's a bunch of white people on the mountain, right? And they even got a Confederate flag around there. I believe so. It's just up there. So I don't understand why is they still being racist with it. I believe that should be definitely taken down. At least I can take the flags down now, right?
But Stone Mountain is just the tip of the iceberg. Indeed, a nationwide debate, now dubbed historical revisionism, is seeing communities across the US decide what to do about monuments commemorating a formative, painful, but still very relevant period of American history. The American Civil War of 1861 to 1865 was the bloodiest conflict in American history. More than 700,000 people lost their lives in a conflict between the Unionists of the North and the Secessionists of the South, an alliance of 11 states which sought to leave the Union and form their own republic, the Confederate States of America. And when it comes to the reasons for the war, one cause stands above the rest: the abolition of slavery. Fighting against the freedom of more than 4 million black people, almost all of whom lived in the South, the Confederate States went to war. And while the South eventually surrendered, monuments to the Confederacy, its leaders and defenders, were erected across the Deep South. Martin O'Toole is the Georgia spokesman for the Sons of Confederate Veterans, a hereditary organisation of the descendants of those who fought for the Confederacy more than 150 years ago.
Well, we have a blood link to those who served the Confederacy in military or civil affairs, and so for us it's family, and so that it means something personal to us. Southerners tend to know something about their families. They tend to know something about their history. And you can look at these different monuments, and most of them represent memorials to the lost soldiers.
The state of Georgia was a key battleground during the American Civil War. However, it's also the cradle of the civil rights movement, the fight for true equality for African Americans a century after slavery was abolished. Dr. Martin Luther King was born and raised in Atlanta, and more than a third of the state's population are black.
The monuments, if you see it as a suppression, of the hopes and dreams and ambition and the human rights of people, then it's thought to be, inappropriate. Because of the suppression, the atrocious legacy of lynchings, that's representing as a continuation of the Confederate of the lost cause. And that's why the monuments become a target for removal and relocation, that it should have no place in today's dialogue.
As monuments, they are intended to stand testament to a different time in the country's history, a time in which social values were different to the present day.
That you're judging everybody by the standards of the present. These values change as populations change, as ideologies change, as people change. But you would also expect that being human, they would at least be willing to tolerate the fact that their ancestors may look at them differently than their own descendants will look at them in the future.
However, to grant pride of place to statues of slave owners in the centre of towns is too much for some. In Augusta, Joyce's hometown, a memorial to the Confederate cause still stands on Broad Street, the town's main thoroughfare.
The Confederate issue seems to be white-centered when it comes to celebration. You know, this constant reminder is that, you know, this was good, where we realize, no, it was not for the better good, it does not follow democratic principles. And so if we're going to have monuments, we prefer to have the ones that do represent democratic principles.
Across the United States, the debate rages over these historical markers, often devolving into violence.
Night after night for the last 60 days.
Following the murder of George Floyd at the hands of US law enforcement in 2020, numerous Confederate statues around the country were removed by rioting crowds, bringing the debate to the fore.
A lot of statues have been pulled down all over the country and damaged or destroyed.
Macon, in Middle Georgia, the largest city in what was once a large slaveholding region. For over a century, a Confederate monument stood at the base of Cotton Avenue. But in June 2022, after years of debate, it was removed.
When I've asked supporters of the actual monuments to give me kind of a history on why they thought it was important, the only thing that they were able to say was it's part of history. They weren't able to tell me who it was, what they did, why they thought they deserved a statue in the first place.
The statue's simple status as a Civil War monument was enough to make it controversial.
On a road called Cotton that was actually used to transport cotton to the river. So if you can imagine how many slaves came up and down this road and there's a Confederate monument on there, it's a little touchy. Also, this is a huge black business district. I can imagine that wasn't a great reminder for them every day.
The wife of soul music legend Otis Redding, a native of Macon, owns the building in front of the plaza, which now stands empty.
I am so happy that it's gone, and it's a great job for the community. I just thank the community for supporting what they want to do with the statue, and they moved it to the correct place.
It's being moved to a more historical location, a more accurate one, which is the cemetery where the Confederate soldiers are.
The statue of the unknown Confederate soldier now stands outside the Rose Hill Cemetery on the outskirts of Macon. The statue may no longer stand in downtown, but the debate continues.
One of the arguments I heard was some people got upset, so now we have to move it. And yeah, that's what happens. If some people get upset, then we should look at why they're getting upset and see what we can do to alleviate that. It was moved before. It's moved again. It will likely be moved one more time or several other times. Things change.
I think it means a lot for the community because we don't live in that kind of civilization no longer. We live in a community where everybody, black, white, Hispanic, they need to be recognized. And I think it's going to be great. We might even put Martin Luther King over there.
As Martin Luther King, Georgia's most famous son, said, "I have a dream that one day my son may not be judged by the colour of his skin, but by the content of his character." Behind the debate over Confederate monuments sits an ugly truth, that Dr. King's dream is still a fantasy. Life in the United States is more difficult for black people or African Americans than it is for people of European descent. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
For Joyce, if America today was truly a society where the truth was self-evident, that all men are created equal, the debate over Confederate monuments would not exist.
Generally, when you have a statue that's dominating, you know, in a public area, and then you would tend to think, okay, they thought that way 100 years ago, and we look at the evidence, are they still feeling this way now? Even if they're not saying this, do their actions match up to what that statue, that monument represents. You know, and a lot of people will say yes, you know, because we still are dealing with racism.
Civil rights organisations in the South say the legacy of the Civil War remains a reality for many black people.
You're thinking, if you look in terms of leadership, if you look in the composition of boards, if you look at the level of medical care, the level of education, you say, now, why are there certain factors of people that are not rising above that? Do they truly want everybody to be involved and to have power and influence, or is it still certain people who have it and they're holding other people down?
In a society where inequality exists, the debate over what is lauded, what is hidden, and what is destroyed will always be present, whether or not it's carved in marble. Whether Confederate monuments are left in place, moved, or destroyed, they remain a part of history.
Each city has a different narrative. Education is a very vital factor in knowing, why the statue was erected and who is there. The monument becomes a part of the cohesive story in telling the narrative. If you take apart any part of that, then you're reducing the veracity of the story.
Today, Monument Avenue, the showpiece thoroughfare of Richmond, Virginia, has no monuments. And while they're gone, the debate continues to rage.
I think that we build on a foundation. We see further because we stand on the shoulders of others. Is what we have in America today was founded by our colonial ancestors, our revolutionary ancestors, and built on by succeeding generations. So that each generation thinks it can improve on what's gone on before. Sometimes they're right, sometimes maybe they're not. But everybody wants to have their finger in the mix, you might say.
In Richmond, the statue of Jefferson Davis, the first and only president of the Confederacy, was vandalized and taken down by force in 2020 as racially motivated riots came to a boiling point. Today, the statue is an exhibit in a local museum, displayed exactly as it was found after the protest, where visitors share their opinions on post-it notes beside the figure. It stands now not as it did, as a monument glorifying the Confederate leader, but as a defeated figure, lying flat, bloodied by paint, its head caved in, a physical manifestation of the flow of history, changing attitudes and social solutions. A historical touchstone, it tells a story spanning 150 years,